Hi, I'm Scott Folk from Apex Tactical Specialties. Today we're going to install the Sigma spring kit into the Smith & Wesson Sigma pistol, as well as the Apex SD and Sigma polymer trigger. The tools you'll need for this installation are a hammer, an 1/8 inch pin punch, and the slave pin that comes in the kit with the trigger and the spring kit. This kit includes a trigger return spring, a slave pin, a striker block spring, and a striker spring. With the slide field stripped and the barrel and recoil assembly out, the first thing we need to do is remove the striker and extractor system. So we're going to take our pin punch in front of the striker, press up underneath, and compress the plastic sleeve forward toward the muzzle. At this point, we're going to take our thumb and slide the back plate off. This can be relatively difficult sometimes, so you have to be cautious, and remove the rear plate. From here, we can pull the striker out of the slide, set it aside, and now we can remove the spring load bearing, extractor spring, and extractor rod from the slide. Now we remove the extractor. We want to hold the extractor in position, press the striker block down, and then release the extractor. From here, we can just slide the extractor out and set it aside. Release this pressure on the striker block, turn it over, and dump it and its spring out of the slide. Give the spring a twist and pull it out. Replace that spring with the spring that comes in the Apex kit, and reassemble the slide in reverse order. With the new spring in the striker block, we're going to put it back in the slide, making sure the spring stays in the striker block. Hold the striker block in the up position, put the extractor back into its notch, hold it in place, and then let go of the striker block. That will hold the striker block in position. From here, we will reassemble the extractor rod, with the rod going in first, then the spring, and then the spring load bearing behind it. Press that all the way in, and that will capture the striker, the extractor, in position. With the extractor back in place, we're going to start working on the striker. We'll use the slide to hold the striker while we work on things. So you put the striker in backwards in the slide, rotate it clockwise or counterclockwise until the striker body hits the side of the slide. This allows us to compress the striker spring with our fingers so we can take the spring cups off. Remember, there are 2 of them that need to be removed. Try not to shoot them across the room. Remove the striker spring, install the new one out of the kit, compress the spring, and put the cups back in position. Once they're back in position, slowly release the spring, make sure everything looks good. Turn the striker back around, put it back in the frame, or in the slide, and at this point, we're ready to put the back plate back on. From here, we need to put the back plate in its notch. We need to compress the striker sleeve. At this point, we're going to press the back plate on while we press the extractor spring down as far as we can. And just slide the back plate into position and then lock it down. Sometimes that can be very difficult to do, and it may take a third hand to hold on to the slide while you push the spring in and put the back plate back on. Just don't forget to wear your safety glasses. From here, we can set the slide aside after we do our safety check. Press the striker forward to make sure it doesn't protrude into the breech. Press the striker block down and then press the striker forward. At this point, you should see the striker go into the breech. Pull the striker back. That'll allow the striker block to pop up into position, then again blocking the striker from going, which is correct operation. From here, we'll set the slide aside and get right into the frame. To disassemble the frame, the first thing we need to do is remove the sear housing pin. This can be pressed out from either side by pushing it through with an 1/8 inch pin punch. Set that pin aside at this point. Now the back of the sear housing block has a gap between that and the frame. I put my pin in here and pry back slightly, carefully, to pop the sear housing block up. Once the block starts to pop up, I'll pull the trigger, and that should normally help get the sear housing block up out of the frame. From here, remove the sear housing block and do not make any alterations. We recommend leaving the factory 2 springs on the sear assembly when you install our kits. To remove this trigger and locking block assembly, we need to remove the trigger pivot pin. The trigger pivot pin has a ring cut all the way around the outside to lock it in position. The slide lock lever is what locks into that ring. The slide lock lever spring applies force down and back at approximately this angle. So our job is to move the front of the slide lock lever up and toward the muzzle. So what I do is I put my thumb on top of the slide lock, put my finger underneath the little tab, I pull it up slightly and push it forward. I'll take the slave pin that comes with the kit and I'll use that to push the pin out. Sometimes it requires moving the slide lock lever forward, up, back, and down in a circular motion while you press on the pin. At this point, I want to pull the trigger back and hold it back if possible and continue trying to slide that pin out. Once I have it started, it should go relatively easily. You may need to push on the trigger bar and the spring a little bit to get it to come free. Once you pull the trigger pivot pin out, set that aside, remove the slave pin from the frame. At this point, if you push the trigger up, it should pop everything out of the frame that you need. Remove the trigger and trigger bar assembly from the frame, and now you're ready to start putting our parts in. We're going to remove the trigger return spring from the trigger. So pull the trigger bar back, grab the trigger return spring and rotate it around toward the back of the trigger bar. At this point you can unhook it from the trigger bar relatively easily, set that aside, and take the new spring that comes in the Apex kit. You want to hook the trigger return spring on, going from the back end using the small end of the spring with the opening in the hook downward toward the tip of the trigger. Hook that into the trigger bar and roll the trigger return spring up into the trigger body. In this orientation, make note that the opening in the trigger return spring is in the up position when it's finally installed. With the new trigger return spring on the trigger bar and in the trigger, we'll go ahead and drop the trigger into the frame and then take the locking block and put it on top and slide it into the frame where it belongs. From here, I'll take the slave pin from the right side of the frame and go in through the trigger body, through the trigger pivot pin, and all the way to the other side. I'll check to make sure that my slave pin is through all of them by looking in from the front. Once I've confirmed that, to check that you can actually pull the trigger and make sure the trigger return spring is under tension. Once that's there, you want to back the trigger return spring out just enough. If you look in from the corner, you can see the trigger return spring, you can see the slave pin come out just enough to clear the side of the frame. From here, we slide our slide lock lever into the gap where it belongs and into position. And again, I will put the slave pin all the way through and check to make sure my slide lock lever is in position. You want to make sure that the spring on the slide lock lever is underneath the locking block. You don't want it up underneath where you can't see the tip of it, because it'll be in the wrong position when you go to reassemble the frame. Now I will take the trigger pivot pin with the shorter end on the left side of the frame, which is inserting the long end first, put it in from the left. Now I need to move the slide lock lever around until that pin clears and can go into the frame. This can take a little bit of work to get it all aligned. Once it starts, you can move the slide lock lever up and down, and you'll feel it's a pretty solid movement, so it's captured on the pin. We'll continue pressing the pin through. In this case, it popped my slave pin out, which is okay. Pull the trigger and bring the trigger bar all the way up. Now, as we push the pin through, we want to check our work as we go, as we put the trigger pivot pin through, and make sure that we get the trigger pivot pin through the trigger return spring. Sometimes you need to go in with a small screwdriver or pin punch and move the trigger spring around to get it to line up to get the pin through. In this case, the pin went right through once I aligned it. Push the pin in, you should hear it lock in, kind of click in position. At this point, if you hold your finger over the top of the trigger bar and pull the trigger bar should articulate smoothly in the frame. And that's our desired operation. From here, release the trigger bar, pull the trigger to let the trigger bar sit up. Now we're going to reinstall the sear housing. You want to use the small pin on the side of the sear and put that in the U-notch on the trigger bar. With the trigger held down, roll the whole assembly down and into position in the frame. When you release the trigger and push it down, it should lock itself in. Now we want to put the sear housing block pin back in the frame as far as we can. If necessary, use a pin punch to center it, and we have the frame assembled. Now we need to check our work. At this point, pull the trigger. You should see the sear articulate back. When we push the trigger bar down, the sear should pop back up. When we let go of the trigger will recapture the sear, and pull again, it should bring the sear back. This is the proper operation for the frame. From this point, we put our slide back on, and we're all finished with the operation. Thanks for watching. If you have any trouble, as always, contact us at www.apextactical.com.